Today, Monday, 18th March, we have had confirmation that the Russian presidential elections has been completed, and as universally expected, President Putin has won a resounding, indeed overwhelming victory. That is, according to the Russian authorities, and I believe it is also the opinion of much the greater part of the world, that part of the world, of course, the world community that takes an interest in these questions. Anyway, the official results say that there has been a 74% turnout, a record in a Russian presidential election, and that out of that 74% turnout, Putin got 87% of the votes. As I said, an overwhelming victory. Now, there has been vehement denunciations of this election across the Western media, from Western governments. There's been attempts to declare the election unfree and unfair, and to announce that it doesn't represent an authentic expression of the opinions of the Russian people, and that there wasn't a diversity of candidates or a sufficient diversity of candidates contesting the election, and, well, every possible claim that one can think of in connection with this election. Now, as I said and discussed in my program yesterday, this is indeed an unusual election by the standards of Russian presidential elections because of the unique conditions in which it is being conducted. Russia is involved in the special military operation, a war by any other words. It is a war universally recognized, including by governments in the West, as a proxy war between the West and Russia. Western leaders, including, for example, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, but also British Prime Ministers, French presidents, others have spoken about the need to defeat Russia in this war. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin talked about the need to weaken Russia. So it is entirely understandable if a majority of people in Russia, probably a very large majority of people in Russia, saw this election as a referendum on President Putin and a referendum on his handling of the war and a referendum on his policies made in connection with the war, and voted accordingly. In other words, they weren't voting as between a diverse field of candidates. There were alternative candidates. The communists were there, the Liberal Democratic Party was there, Just Russia was also there. They don't seem to have done very much in this election. But anyway, there were alternative candidates people could have voted for if they chose to. But overwhelmingly, and I have no doubt that this is correct, they chose to come out and vote for Putin because they feel that they need to do that at a time when their country is involved in a proxy war against a West that is seeking to defeat it. It is not at all difficult to understand the psychology behind this vote. And for the record, I think that whatever manipulations there might have been, and I'm not denying that there might have been some manipulations, but whatever manipulations there might have been, I think the outcome of this vote is pretty reflective, accurately reflects, in fact, the general state of Russian opinion at this particular point in time. And I don't think anybody, even many of those people in the West who claim otherwise, actually truly doubt the fact. Now, I say that, I make the last point, because over the last couple of hours, since I got up this morning, I have been reading in the British newspapers in particular, but I believe this is widespread across the media world in the West, a truly remarkable claim, one which I have to say I've never encountered before. This is that pictures of queues of people in Russian cities, at Russian embassies around the world, queues of people queuing up to vote, is some kind of a protest against the election that they've chosen to vote in. I have to say, I find this one of the most preposterous claims I've ever encountered, and I have seen many preposterous claims in my time. I mean, on its face, this is completely absurd. It is desperate. It shows that it was anticipated that there would be lines of people queuing up to vote. As I said, turnout in this election appears to have been particularly high, and somebody or some people decided that this needed to be explained away, and the way the decision was made to explain it away is to try to represent this as a protest against Putin and against the election in general. All I can say about it is, again, that is a desperate claim. It is an absurd one. And frankly, I don't think it needs any analysis or discussion beyond that. So anyway, we have the election. President Putin is re-elected for, well, I think it's now his fourth term as president. I'm going to say straight away that in some ways, I do regret this fact. The original Russian constitution limited the president's terms of office to 2 consecutive terms. Putin stood down after the end of his second term. Dmitry Medvedev was elected president. Putin there was a reshuffle. Putin became prime minister. He served as prime minister. And then he came back, as he was constitutionally and legally able to do. I don't dispute that. Served a third term. And, well, I thought that would be the end. And then the decision was made in 2020 to extend the time further and to give him 2 further terms if he chose, which means that in theory, assuming he stands again in 6 years' time and is elected again in 6 years' time, that he will have been continuously at the helm of Russian politics for over 36 years since Boris Yeltsin appointed him acting Prime Minister of Russia in the summer of 1999. Now that is the longest period of time, if it happens, that any leader in Russia has exercised power since, I believe, the time of Catherine the Great. In fact, it might even be longer than Catherine the Great's reign. Already it looks as if Putin, if he completes his current term, will have been leading Russia for longer than, for example, Joseph Stalin. And I think there should be alternation of power. I think leaders should replace themselves. I was disappointed, I make no secret about this, in 2020, when the decision was made to extend the time that Putin would be president. At the time, I thought it might be a mistake. I think quite a few people in Russia at the time, maybe not amongst the generality of the people, but within the elite, perhaps also thought it might be a mistake. It has been very much, in my opinion, the product of Western policy since then, since that decision in 2020 was made. It has been the product of all Western policy and Western decisions that has caused people like me to now think that perhaps that decision in 2020 to give Putin 2 more terms, of which he's now serving the first, perhaps wasn't a mistake after all, but was the correct decision. It's clear, even looking back, that Russia was facing multiple challenges and that probably a strong case can be made that an experienced leader who's already shown that he can keep a cool head in a crisis was needed in the face of the pressures, and that leader could only be Putin, and that made it necessary logically to give him further terms. Anyway, there we are. One way or the other, it's important to say that these are all Russian decisions. We can comment about them from outside, but to repeat a point which I've made many times in the past, it is ultimately for Russians, the elite and the people, to decide on how they're governed and who governs them. And there is no doubt at all, there is no doubt whatsoever, at least in my mind, and I think in that of the vast majority of people around the world, that at the moment, the person they want to lead them is the man who's just been elected, Vladimir Putin. Now, of course, the West is furious. Doesn't mean the rest of the world is. China, Cuba, other countries, North Korea, India, I suspect before long, most of them will probably be sending their congratulations to Putin on his re-election. The Pope, surprisingly, has broken ranks with the West. He's also sent Putin his congratulations, something which I suspect is going to infuriate many people in the West. Western governments comes shortly after the Pope's advice to Ukraine that the right thing to do is to sit down and negotiate with the Russians, not to press on with the war. Now, those comments have already been sharply criticised, and the Pope's support, or rather congratulations to Putin, will be seen as compounding the Pope's, follies as far as those people are concerned. But most countries in the world, most governments in the world, most people around the world are probably pleased to see Putin back. And again, it's not entirely difficult to understand why. This is a major period of transition in world affairs. The United States and the Western powers have been doing everything they possibly can, or so it seems to most people, so it seems to me, to prolong the period of Western ascendancy beyond its obvious sell-by date. Russia has had to bear an awful lot of the weight and the pressure, and Russia has been resisting. And most governments around the world, which quietly welcome the transition to a multipolar system, will see in this election confirmation that the Russians are intent on staying the course, that they will continue their resistance to the West, that they will continue with a special military operation, that they will see the war in Ukraine through, that they will forge forward with all of the new relationships that have been constructed around the BRICS, and most governments around the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in China and India, in Latin America, they will be pleased that that is so, even, of course, if they're not prepared for the moment to say it too loudly. And going back to a point I made in my program yesterday, Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, has told us, and I'm sure that this is true, is that the West put heavy pressure on many global South, global majority countries to sign up to the West's statement denouncing the Russian elections, and as an expression of the fact that most countries actually are quietly pleased at the outcome of the Russian elections. Well, as an expression of that, according to Polyansky, nearly all of the governments that were so pressured to sign this Western statement in the end refused to do so. Now, on the topic of that pressure by the West upon the Russians, the pressure which has consolidated support in Russia behind President Putin, and which has also undoubtedly, in my opinion, consolidated global support behind President Putin as well. Putin had this to say in the interview he gave to Yevgeny Kiselyov a few days ago, which I have discussed extensively in various programs that I have done on this channel. Now, it's a paragraph which I don't think has attracted the attention that it deserves, but it's a very interesting one. And this is what Putin says. And he said this, as I said in this interview to Kiselyov, and in response to a question to Kiselyov. He said, Western elites, blinded by their Russophobia, were delighted when they brought us to the line after which our attempts to stop the war unleashed by the West in Ukraine in 2014 by force began when we switched to conducting a special military operation. They even rejoiced because they believed that they would now finish us off under this barrage of sanctions, practically a sanctions war declared against us with the help of Western weapons and war through Ukrainian nationalists. They would finish off Russia. Hence the slogan, to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield. So what Putin is saying there, it's the first time, so far as I'm aware, that he has said it, but it's something that Alex Christoforou and I have discussed on the Duran many times, is that there were people in the West who were very happy when the Ukraine war began, when the Russians launched their special military operation. There were people who almost certainly wanted the special military operation to happen because they'd put together what they assumed would be a crushing sanctions package. They expected that under the weight of this sanctions package, the Russian economy would collapse, and that would lead to a major political crisis in Russia, and that would then lead to regime change in Russia, and that would, at the very least, result in the fall of President Putin, and very likely to the eventual installation in power of a weak government that would once again be beholden to the West. Now, Alex Christoforou and I have said this many times. We said how always the ultimate strategy was to achieve regime change in Russia, and it turns out that Putin, in this paragraph, is essentially telling us the same thing. Now, what he is not telling us is something that I have heard, that though Putin felt that he'd been maneuvered into launching the special military operation in February 2022, the shelling of Donbass, all of the various other steps that had been taken, left him with no choice, at least not as far as he can see. What I have heard is that over those days, after the special military operation was launched, he was deeply depressed, that the mood in the Kremlin was extremely gloomy, that there was massive uncertainty as to how the economy would respond to the economic war, and that there was massive uncertainty as to how the Russian people would respond. And that the fact that the population rallied behind the wall and supported the government, and that the economy remained stable, despite a frankly disorganized address by a clearly exhausted and stressed Vladimir Putin right at the start. Well, all of that came as a huge surprise and a massive relief. And of course, it has set the scene for the situation we have now. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say this in this same interview by Yevgeny Kiselyov. Later came the realization amongst the Western elites that it was unlikely, in other words, that there would not be a strategic defeat of Russia, and still later that it was impossible. And they came to understand that instead of a strategic defeat of Russia, they are faced with powerlessness, a powerlessness despite the fact that they were relying on the might of the all-powerful United States. They felt frustrated seeing the unity of the Russian people, the fundamentals of the Russian financial and economic system and its sustainability, and before the growing capabilities of the Russian armed forces. And about that, again, I think Putin is right. And it is this sense of frustration and the anger that it is causing, the frustration and anger that we see in the West today, that I think goes very far to explaining the vehemence in response to the election that has just taken place in Russia and its outcome. Now, alongside this anger and frustration, which undoubtedly does exist in the West, the fact that the whole Ukraine project has ended up exposing Western weakness instead of strength, Russian strength instead of weakness, that it has consolidated Putin's position instead of undermining it. Well, beyond all that anger and frustration, you do get squirreled in a few places grudging admissions of one other overwhelming fact about this election, which is that for the time being, Putin is there to stay. There is a very bitter and angry article in The Economist, which effectively concedes as much, that there is no real way now in which regime change in Russia can be achieved, and or at least that there will be any kind of change of regime in Russia. And we can see that in other places too. For the moment, no one in the West appears to willing to rethink Western policy, notwithstanding that grudging acceptance of overwhelming reality. Anyway, there we are. A Russian election over 3 days. That, incidentally, is a new departure. There have been changes also to the Russian voting system. It's become much easier to engage in electronic voting. I'm not able to comment on the propriety of these electoral changes. I don't actually see much opposition to them. I suspect that the decision to extend the voting over 3 days and to make electronic voting easier was partly intended to increase the turnout, which of course it did. But anyway, one way or the other, the election is now out of the way. There don't seem to have been any significant protests against it. A few people in some places acted by themselves, but overall people voted. The elections were conducted in an orderly way, and the fact that there were queues in a few places, people queuing up to vote, is not a sign that they were opposed to the election. It is a sign, obviously, that they wanted to vote. Anyway, one party undoubtedly is going to be especially disappointed by this outcome, and this is the Ukrainian government. This is not because they were seriously expecting to disrupt the election itself or to prevent Putin from winning the election, but because their massive operation on the border was clearly intended to embarrass Putin, to seize Russian territory, apparently, according to the sources I'm getting, to create a sensation, at the very least, by gaining control of a nuclear weapons facility. And all of that has catastrophically failed. Now, Putin has commented on all of this. The Kremlin has not yet provided a transcript of his precise words, but he says that the total forces that the Ukrainians accumulated for this operation came to 5,000 men, 2 brigades perhaps, or 1 reinforced brigade. Large numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles were used. The losses, the total aggregate losses of this force were around 40%, and a significant proportion of those were people who were killed or wounded. And we're getting figures that out of that force of about 5,000 that Putin says was committed to this operation, around 600 have been killed or severely wounded, so severely wounded that they're unlikely to participate in the operation, in the war again. And I think this is probably roughly correct. Putin also pointedly said, by the way, that though Russia does not have the death penalty, any Russian citizen who participates in these attacks on Russia on Ukraine's behalf, as far as the Russians are concerned, is committing treason and will be treated accordingly, including on the battlefield. So there we are. A complex military operation carried out by Ukraine along the border, attempts to carry out attacks on Russian border villages, to advance towards the town of Graivoron, slightly further beyond the border in the west of Russia, to seize, perhaps, it seems, a nuclear weapons facility. All of that has completely failed. The only result has been large numbers of losses, 600 men dead and wounded, dead and severely wounded, large numbers of tanks destroyed, large numbers of infantry fighting vehicles destroyed, and nothing has been achieved as a result of it. Now, as unfortunately tends to happen after these failures, the Ukrainian authorities have taken out their anger by launching rocket and missile attacks on Russian border towns, Belgorod, Duran and the others. And unfortunately, again, some of these rockets and drone strikes have got through, and some people, civilians, have been killed, and some damage has been done. Now, the Russians also carry out many missile and drone attacks across Ukraine. But in every case that I'm aware of, these Russian drone and missile attacks across Ukraine, which of course are on a far greater scale than those that the Ukrainians carried out over the last few days on the Russian border towns, well, the Russian drone and missile attacks have a discernible military purpose. I cannot see what purpose these Ukrainian missile and drone attacks have, unless it is the intention of the Ukrainians to renew their attacks on the Russian border villages and cities, which is starting to look rather unlikely. And just to say again that military strikes on civilian settlements with no overt military purpose behind them are an acknowledged war crime. Just saying that. Anyway, let's move on. Putin has been very busy today. He has been talking at length about the situation, and he made a very interesting comment today, of which again the Kremlin has not yet provided us with a transcript, but which is reported by the official Russian news agency TASS. TASS reports Putin's words in this way: Russian troops have taken the initiative in the special zone, operation zone, literally shredding the enemy's forces in some areas, President Putin told reporters at his campaign headquarters. In general, the Russian armed forces have taken the initiative completely. At some areas, our troops are literally shredding the enemy into pieces. The Russian military is advancing day by day, and its strategy currently implies something more than just active defense. They're moving gradually and cautiously, but they advance every day. Now, these are Putin's words, which I'm taking from the TASS news agency. I'm not suggesting that TASS is misreporting them, but it's always nice to have the actual transcript from the Kremlin. But the key words are these: that the Russian armed forces are now engaged in something more than just active defense. We may be starting to move beyond that condition of aggressive attrition. It could be that at some point over the next few weeks and months, we will start to see a genuine offensive, and the Russians, instead of improving their positions along the front line, as the defense ministry, the Russian defense ministry likes to say, that the Russians are actually now working gradually towards a position where they can actually finally launch an offensive. Now, that is interesting, and it suggests, firstly, the effect of the attrition on the Ukrainians. It reflects the fact that Ukrainian forces are now short of men, short of ammunition, short of machines, short of air defense missiles, all of those things. But it could also be that the Russians now expect that before long they will be in full control of the Donbass. Now, protecting the Donbass was the original purpose of the special military operation, Putin has reminded people recently of this, even if most people tend to forget it. His original purpose in ordering the special military operation was to protect Donbass, though he made it clear at the time that there were various other objectives, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, demilitarization, denazification, that kind of thing, which immediately became Russia's war aims. But the point is that given that Putin recognized the two Donbass republics, or rather Russia originally recognized the two Donbass republics within their Soviet-era administrative territories, and given also that since September 2022, the Russians consider the entire territory of Donbass to be territory within the Russian Federation. It could be argued, in fact, in Russia, it is argued that the battles that are going on in Donbass are happening on Russian territory and therefore are inherently defensive. Now, if Donbass is brought fully under Russian control, liberated as the Russians would say, something which yesterday the London Times was saying certain experts in the West expect to happen at some point over the next few months. Perhaps it'll be even sooner than that. Well then, if the war continues, one could argue that if the Russians continue to advance beyond Donbass, beyond the boundaries of Russia's existing territory, then they're conducting offensive operations and no longer defensive ones. And of course, that could imply some kind of Russian operation in Kharkiv region and in other places too. Just saying. But we do seem to be, according to Putin, moving towards a situation where the Russians, even according to their own very cautious descriptions of the conduct of the war, are no longer talking about active defense. They're starting to talk about something that effectively acknowledges that what we're looking at is an offensive from this moment onwards. Just saying. We'll just have to wait and see what it is exactly that Putin has in mind. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn to the situation on the battlefronts. And here, I will admit straight away that there's a problem in that because media reporting has been overwhelmingly dominated by the presidential election, we have less information about what is going on the battlefronts. However, it does seem that major battles continue to focus on the area from Marinka to Bakhmut. That takes in, of course, Avdiivka, Georgievka, Krasnogorovka, Pervomaisky, and, of course, the area around Avdiivka and Bakhmut itself. So this area in central Donbass. There was lots of reports cascading yesterday, more reports from Ukrainian sources, that the Ukrainians are now being pushed back from these three villages, Orlovka, Toninka, and Berdichi. It seems to be generally accepted that the Russians are now in control of Orlovka, Probably they control BITCHUTE as well. There's still heavy fighting, however, going on around these places. And it's likely that with the election out of the way, we will probably see a further offensive by the Russians in these places, west of these villages. So it's plausible that over the next couple of days, we will be seeing further big Russian advances happening in the Avdiivka area, and a push by the Russians to sort out and resolve finally the situation in places like Krasnogorovka and Pervomaisky, and in the Bakhmut area as well. But it also seems as if other things might be happening in other places as well. The Russians continue to press hard around Rabotino, though it's important to say again that fighting in this area of Zaporozhye region, the area where the Ukrainians conducted their biggest offensive in the summer, the main part of their offensive in the summer, that fighting is on a much smaller scale than anything that we see near to Avdiivka, for example, or to Bakhmut. But anyway, the Russians do seem to be pressing hard, and the latest maps that I've seen, not that I'm good at reading maps, suggest to me that most of Bradley Square has now been either reoccupied by the Russians or is in the grey zone. But it seems that the Russians are pushing hard now towards another village, or rather towards another town in the southern part of the combat line, Gulia-Polye, and we've had a report from the Russian Defense Ministry that a village called Mirnoye, which is south of Gulia-Polye, has now also been captured by the Russians as a result of a Russian offensive operation. And it's starting to look as if the Russians might be preparing for a major offensive in the south, that all of these steps are under Rabotino, Bradley Square, Gulia-Polye, that they might be intended to lay the foundation for a general offensive towards the Dnieper in this area, perhaps ultimately taking in the town as the big, important city of Zaporozhye as well. We'll just have to wait and see. Perhaps that could come in the summer. Who knows? And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry broadcast a video of fighting going on in the Bakhmut area. There was the video itself doesn't tell us very much, but the caption says, in Artyomovsk, that's the same Bakhmut direction, a unit of the assault battalion named after hero of Russia, Major Viktor Obeykov, of the Yug group of forces Ivanovo-based airborne troops formation, continued to improve, in other words advance, the situation of the Russian units along the front line and captured a Ukrainian stronghold northwest of Artyomovsk, in other words Bakhmut. That suggests fighting going on somewhere around the village of Bogdanovka. And the report goes on to say, during reconnaissance of Ukrainian positions from the air, the paratroopers uncovered the main firing positions and strongholds with clusters of enemy manpower. After capturing the enemy stronghold, the airborne troops' assault detachments performed a full sweep up. So it looks like some kind of battle took place over the last 24 hours in the Bakhmut area, that the Russians registered a significant advance somewhere to the northwest of Bakhmut, and by definition to the northeast of Chasiv Yar. Perhaps an important part of Bogdanovka has been captured, or it might have been somewhere else. But again, that might point to some kind of offensive being launched by the Russians from two directions towards Chasov Yar. Reports suggest Ivanivska, largely captured by the Russians now, with the Russians in control of a significant amount of territory to the south of Ivanivska as well. So an attack upon Chasov Yar from the south, and it could be that the Russians, expecting the imminent fall of Ivanivska, are now again re-emphasizing the attack on Bogdanovka, that they've made significant progress there, and are also preparing to attack Chasov Yar from the north. Just saying. So lots perhaps going on that we don't fully know. We'll probably, presumably, be getting further reports before long. And there's been, in the meantime, a very interesting further article in the London Times, which clearly has the job of pre-alerting people in Britain that the things on the battlefields are going terribly wrong for Ukraine. And the title of the article is Ukraine digs in with dragon's teeth as Russia's glide bombs take a toll. And the article begins, along the road to Kupiansk, so we're now in the far north, where the booms of artillery echo and smoke rises in the air, Lemur, an infantryman, gives his bleak assessment of the battle. Effing awful, he says, glancing back in the direction where the Russian army is trying to break through. We can barely hold the line, let alone move forward. We are losing so many people. There are so many bodies. We can't even bring them all back. So Ukrainians still clinging on to places like Sinkovka, for example, but it is taking a hideous toll. And then we go on to read, ever since the fall last month of Avdiivka, the first new Ukrainian town Russia has taken since the early months of the invasion, apart, that is to say, from Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Bakhmut, just saying. Anyway, since the early months of the invasion, fear has coursed through frontline communities about where the Russians will strike next. Having failed in last year's counteroffensive to press through Russia's heavily fortified defences, Ukraine is now building its own long lines of deep trenches, mines and dragon's teeth to ensnare tanks that might try to break through and regain recaptured territory that the Russians held in the first year of full-scale war. In other words, they're building fortifications, trenches and fortified lines in the Kupiansk area to prevent not just the Russians recapturing Kupiansk, but pressing on towards Izium and Balakleia. And then it goes on to say this, but as they do so, Ukrainian soldiers have been confronted by a new and dangerous menace, so-called glide bombs, modified Soviet-era bombs, retrofitted with smart wings, and which turn them into guided missiles. No, actually, they're not guided missiles. They're glide bombs. Missiles have rocket engines or turbofan engines, but I'm not going to press the point. Dropped from aircraft operating over Russian-controlled territory, they represent a new lethal threat against which Ukraine is poorly equipped to fight, however strongly, if slowly, it is fortifying its front lines. Kupiansk, which was occupied by the Russians for more than 6 months of 2022, is one such place. 5 lines of trenches, minefields and dragon's teeth stretch over 2 miles behind the front line, where Ukrainian soldiers face off against their Russian adversaries. whilst they might provide new fighting positions and defences should the Ukrainians fall back, they are no match for the 1,500 kilo glide bombs, decimating frontline troops since their first appearance some 3 months ago. The extent of their destructive power was powerfully demonstrated in the battle for Avdiivka. Maxim Zhorin, a soldier in Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, I believe that refers to the Azov Brigade, described in a telegram post the impact of these munitions as 60 to 80 of these glide bombs crashed into Ukrainian lines in Avdiivka every day. These bombs completely destroy any position, Zhorin wrote. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one. And then we're told outside Vovchansk, that's up north, Kharkiv region, on Ukraine's northern border, Kharkiv's military governor, Oleg Sinegubov, is inspecting the construction of the new defense lines. Whilst President Zelensky has praised Kharkov's effort, there has been little joined-up effort to reinforce the front lines in this way. Part of that is political. To build defences behind exposed frontline towns like Chasiv Yar, just outside Bakhmut, could be tantamount to declaring they are lost. So there we go. The Ukrainians, they're paying a terrible price for trying to hold on to the existing front lines. We have a Ukrainian soldier engaging in expletives, saying that the situation is awful and that they can't recover the bodies of their dead. And we have an admission there that construction of front lines, of fortified lines, is patchy and is not joined up, and that there are lots of gaps, and that there are political problems because building fortified lines behind Chasiv Yar would be an admission that Chasiv Yar is going to fall, and that is politically difficult, and further admissions that in the face of overwhelming Russian firepower, especially the glide bombs, these fortifications are not going to hold anyway, even if they're ever built. So, the London Times, once upon a time, was compulsory reading for the British political elite. It used to be Britain's newspaper of record. It has long since lost that status, but it continues to be a newspaper that the elite does read. And of course, when they read things like this, and they will, what this is telling them is that Ukraine can't hold. It is unable to withstand the Russian advance. And in fact, we're getting more information, also, by the way, from the London Times, about the advice Admiral Radakin and Grant Shapps, the British Defence Secretary, gave to the Ukrainians during their recent trip to Kiev. They said to the Ukrainians, apparently, don't even think about going on the offensive. If you do, you'll be smashed. Focus instead on the Black Sea. Continue to send lots of water drones on hit-and-run strikes against Russian warships. That's more productive. Forget about, in other words, the ground war. Retreat back to your fortified lines and hope for the best. But we see that the London Times tells us that that might not be enough, that the Russian forces, when they move forward, they will smash through because the defences, such as they are not strong enough to withstand the Russian glide bombs. Now here I need to again acknowledge once again a debt, in the sense that back in the autumn of 2022, a member of the community from India, who had served in the Indian Armed Forces, told me precisely this very thing. He said that if the Russians do achieve air supremacy over Ukraine, if their air force is able to operate at will across Ukraine, then the effect will be devastating, that the artillery can do massive damage to fortified positions. This is a prolonged and slow business, whereas dropping heavy bombs as powerful as the 1,500 kilo bombs on fortified positions, the effect of that is absolutely devastating and will break the strongest defenses. And we see Ukrainian soldiers admitting to that very thing. So, a bleak picture. Now, I think that after the excitements and melodramas of President Macron's comments about the West deploying troops to Ukraine, I think that has generally subsided. I don't get the impression that any of that now is going to happen. Anyway, given that this is so, given that the Russians have made it very clear that they're not interested in freezing the conflict, Putin has said this again today. He says that there's no sense in the Russians agreeing to a ceasefire just because the other side is running short of ammunition. This too is absurd. Given that all of this is so, given that the Ukrainians clearly do think that the Russians are going to break through before long, I mentioned how the London Times says that the Ukrainians are unwilling to build fortifications behind frontline towns like Chasiv Yar because of political problems, the fact that that would concede that frontline towns are going to fall. But there's been reports over the last few days that the Ukrainians are building fortified lines, fortified positions behind Orechov in Zaporizhia region, which suggests that they expect that before long the Russians are going to capture Orechov. And we've also got a very tantalizing report today that the Ukrainians are now building fortified lines west of Nikolaev, which is a town on the Dnieper River, on the west bank of the Dnieper River. Now, that is intriguing. It suggests that the Ukrainians expect that at some point the Russians are going to recapture Kherson region, the town of Kherson, west of the Dnieper, and Kherson region, west of the Dnieper as well, and will resume their offensive towards Odessa, taking in Nikolaev as well, and advancing from Nikolaev towards Odessa. It's the only explanation, if this report about the fortified lines being built there is true. Anyway, given that all this is so, one does again wonder what, if any, plan there is. Well, I'm going to suggest, I think it's now clear, that there is in fact no plan. I think that the West doesn't really believe in negotiations with the Russians. The West doesn't really expect that any kind of understanding with the Russians about Ukraine is going to be made. They've given up hoping that President Putin is going to fall. This latest presidential election has now put that beyond that issue now beyond doubt. They've given up on the idea of arming Ukraine to the level that it can withstand the Russians by itself. There's even been a report, actually, in the United States that the Pentagon itself is now $10 billion short of its own weapons and needs at least $10 billion to replenish its own arsenals, and that this, in effect, precludes delivery of more weapons in any great number to Ukraine until these arsenals are replenished, which suggests, by the way, that even if the $61 billion package, which remains marooned in Congress, is eventually passed, it will be some time before the Pentagon is able to send substantial deliveries of further weapons to Ukraine. Just saying. But anyway, given that militarily speaking, there are no good options, given that Putin is securely in place, given that the Russian economy is looking strong, and given that, as I said, negotiations have been ruled out, it's clear to me that the Western governments have no real plan about what to do. And perhaps, given the extent to which they have boxed themselves in, they cannot have a plan. Coming up with a plan at this time is politically impossible, and therefore, even in the face of pending defeat, it can't be considered. Well, I'm not here to give advice. I've given enough of it, and of course, probably nobody's listening, but anyway, whatever. Let me just say one thing, which I do think Western governments ought to be doing and ought to be preparing for now. If they quietly understand that defeat is coming in Ukraine, which I think they do, there may be a few deluded people, perhaps the president himself, who think otherwise, but I think a consensus is now starting to take shape that the war is indeed lost. Anyway, given that this is so, I think they do need to start thinking about two things that they do need to do, and they're of a technical nature. The first is about evacuating their people from Ukraine. There's still lots of them in Ukraine, lots of them in Kiev itself. Diplomats, other aid workers, officials, administrators, all those sort of people. Now, the thing to understand about Kiev is that it is far from the Western borders. There are no secure air links to Kiev. Westerners who go to Kiev have to go there by train. The railway journey is long. It is highly likely, if the Russians do launch an offensive, that they will take action to paralyze and even cut the railway system. There is a risk, or so it seems to me, that large numbers of Westerners might find themselves marooned in a city, Kiev, which might before long become a war zone, and at a time when Western governments acknowledge that air defenses in Ukraine are starting to fall short. There's also, by the way, the further complex issue of what the various factions in Kiev might do if they start to sense that the end is nigh. And some of these are difficult people whose actions perhaps cannot be relied upon in a crisis. Just saying. So I think that Western governments need to start thinking very hard about how they're going to get their people out of Kiev if these situations start to develop at some point over the next few weeks and months. So that's one thing they need to do, and perhaps they need to start thinking not just about Kiev, but about other places also, about any Westerners, for example, who find themselves east of the Dnieper, or even in places on the west bank of the Dnieper, but which might be exposed to Russian military action, like Dnipro and the rest. I think that working out evacuation plans and doing so urgently would be definitely a good idea. And the second is that Western governments also need to think about refugees. If it looks like places like Kiev are about to fall, there might be a significant movement of people towards Ukraine's borders with Europe. Now, none of that may be imminent. It's probably not going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or next week or even next month. But just to say, wars of attrition have a habit of ending suddenly. This was true of the American Civil War, for example. It was also true of the First World War. The fact that the front lines have been relatively stable for more than 2 years doesn't mean that they will always remain so. And it could be, if there is a military collapse, and there are many reports in the West that say that Western officials are worried about this, if there is a military collapse, things could start to become a lot more dynamic, and that might result, well, first of all, in the risk of Westerners becoming stranded in various places in Ukraine, and of large movements of people towards the western border. It is always better to have plans and preparations for this sort of thing prepared well in advance. We saw how important that was in Afghanistan, where the collapse also came suddenly and caught the United States by surprise, with the result that the evacuation from Kabul was chaotic and botched in a way that in the end reflected badly on the president. And by the way, the same was also true in 1975 in Saigon. So it's always best to prepare for these things well in advance rather than be overtaken by events. And given that Putin is now talking about the Russian army moving beyond active operations, given the reports we're getting from the front lines, given the continued build-up of Russian forces, given the implacable mood amongst the Russians, as reflected not just in the statements of people like Medvedev, but of Putin as well, I think starting preparations to do the sort of things I've been talking about, planning for them, frankly, I would start on that now. Whether that is what is perhaps already happening or whether that will be done, that's another matter. But anyway, the likelihood is, as the London Times said yesterday, the Donbass likely to fall completely to the Russians fairly soon, some point within the next couple of months, by midsummer perhaps. That will be the decisive breakthrough in the war. If Donbass falls, there'll be no real positions that the Ukrainians can create east of the Dnieper. The Russians could be opposite Dnipro, as the Ukrainians say, within a few months. The Russians are talking about buffer zones in Ukraine, in Kharkiv region. There are reports that the Ukrainians are evacuating more villages and populated centres in Kharkiv region. We've just seen the London Times tell us that the fortified lines that the Ukrainians are building are patchy and incomplete and are unable to withstand Russian bombing. So it could be the case. It's starting to look increasingly as if it is the case that the collapse is going to happen fairly soon. And it would be best if the West this time, and the United States especially this time, were prepared for it. Anyway, this is where I end my Russia-Ukraine commentary today. But before I finish this program, I do want to say something about a speech that Senator Schumer of the United States, US Senate, has just given. He's made a speech in which he's basically said that the time has come for Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to stand down. He's talking about the need for political change in Israel. He's talked about his good relations of the past with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he's made it fairly clear that he no longer thinks that Prime Minister Netanyahu is the right man for the job. And President Biden and other officials in the administration have basically supported what Senator Schumer has said. And a lot of people are putting a lot of weight on these words. Had they been said, say in November or December, I would have done the same. But after all that has happened, to be frank, I have become very cynical about this, about words like this. It is, I think, fairly well established that President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu don't get on terribly well. In fact, there have been many tensions between them in the past, and no doubt there still are. But I do have to say a number of things about Chuck Schumer's words. Firstly, is it really appropriate for the United States to tell the people and government of Israel who should be the Prime Minister of Israel? I can see why many people would not want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu remain in office. I am one of those people. I think his leadership of Israel has been disastrous. I acknowledge that he is a clever man and a politically savvy operator, but I think that he has led Israel into a strategic cul-de-sac, and I think that his handling of affairs before and after the events of the 7th of October has been terrible. But I still am uncomfortable when US officials take it upon themselves to say that they don't think that the Prime Minister of Israel should remain in office and should be replaced by someone else. Ultimately, that, it seems to me, is Israel's business. What, however, the United States can legitimately say, what it should have been saying for months now, is that whilst it is Israel's decision who the Prime Minister of Israel is, it is the United States' business and concern what Israel does with the weapons that the United States supplies to Israel. And the United States has been supplying lots of weapons to Israel over the last few weeks and months, even whilst Prime Minister Netanyahu remains in office doing all of the things that the United States disapproves of. Would it not be more proper, more coherent, and a lot more effective, rather than make these dubious calls for Prime Minister Netanyahu's removal, for, in effect, regime change in Israel? A regime change which, by the way, were it to happen, might have unpredictable consequences which the United States might not be able to control, and whose outcome the United States might not actually like. Might it not be a lot more sensible to simply stop supplying Israel with all those weapons and to say to the Israeli government, well, look, the United States isn't happy with the way in which its weapons are being used, and what Israel needs to do is to reconsider its approach to Gaza and to other security issues. And of course, that's for the Israeli government to decide. It's for the Israeli government to decide who leads it, the Israeli people to decide who lead that government. But the United States does have its concerns. It's worried that Israel is not heeding those concerns. And in light of this, it cannot continue to provide military support for an essentially military operation which isn't achieving the results the United States wants, but which instead is becoming counterproductive. That is one thing. Or the United States could do something completely different, much more simple than that. If there is concern that interrupting the flow of weapons to Israel might put Israel at risk, why not do something else? Why not support the moves which have been made in the Security Council for a ceasefire resolution? A real ceasefire resolution covering the situation in Gaza. A ceasefire resolution which, of course, does order a ceasefire, does require the release of hostages. There is no controversy about this on the Security Council, does allow for humanitarian access, does all of those things. Why not do that instead? Would that not be a much more appropriate diplomatic approach to take than, again, to tell the Israelis who should be Israel's Prime Minister? I'm just saying. Why not go for that ceasefire resolution, perhaps in some ways influencing its wording, agreeing its terms? I think there would be willingness to negotiate over that. Why not go for that rather than these complicated schemes of setting up piers on Gaza's coast? In a wonderful live stream with him, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis pointed out that live stream that we did with him on the Duran, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis pointed out, as he did on his own channel, Daniel Davis Deep Dive, that in fact the original idea for this pier came from none other than Prime Minister Netanyahu. Why not dispense with all of that, dispense with schemes of that nature, dispense with calls for Prime Minister Netanyahu to step down, and straightforwardly back a ceasefire resolution at the Security Council? West American leaders are addicted to this idea of regime change in other countries, of telling other countries, including Israel now, as it turns out, who should lead them and who should not. And I don't think this addresses the problem. Firstly, this call from the United States is not just uncomfortable, doesn't just make me uncomfortable. I basically feel that it is wrong. It is the United States, again, dictating who should lead another country to the citizens of that other country. But, beyond that, it's not going to solve anything. First of all, it's far from clear to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to step down in response to this call. It's more likely, or so it seems to me, to make him even more determined to stay in place, and it's quite plausibly likely going to rally support to him from people in Israel who do not like being told who should leave their country by the United States. That is one. And secondly, it's difficult to imagine, given the carte blanche that the United States is in all other respects giving Israel, that any other Prime Minister of Israel is going to act in any way that is substantively different from Prime Minister Netanyahu's. Now, there are some people, like Larry Johnson at Sonar 21, his amazing website, who say that this is all smoke and mirrors. It's intended to give the impression that the United States, rather the Biden administration, is really angry with Prime Minister Netanyahu, is distancing itself from what the Israelis are doing, but is continuing to support Israel. In other words, this is a simulation of action instead of real action. And I think Larry Johnson is probably right. But the point I'm making in this program is that even if this is genuine, then it is wrong, completely wrong, both in intent and execution. And once again, simply highlights how defective in its performance American foreign policy has now become. Anyway, this is where I'm going to end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there. I believe that we again have a 15% discount on shirts. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.